has been called a god, a giant, a trickster, and a monster. He is the reason the world will end, and the terrifying thing is, he thinks it is funny. Welcome to Shadow Folklore. Today, Loki, the wind across the Norse landscape, carries no mercy. It cuts through birch forests skeletal with winter, howls over black volcanic beaches, where the North Atlantic crashes against stone, screams across ice fields that stretch toward a horizon where sky and frozen earth become indistinguishable. This is a land that lives in the throat of chaos, where geysers explode without warning from cracked ground, where the sun disappears for months and returns only to barely graze the edge of the world, where the very earth splits and bleeds molten rock. The air smells of salt, of sulfur, of pine resin and cold so profound it burns the lungs. In the great halls, fires roar against the dark. But the dark always waits. It seeps between the logs. It pools in the corners. It knows that every flame will eventually die, that every hall will collapse, that every hero will become food for worms or crows. And somewhere in that darkness, something is laughing. The old skalds knew this, when they gathered in the firelight, when mead loosened tongues and the night stretched long. They spoke of gods who were not distant or transcendent, but close, dangerously close. Gods who walked among giants, who bled, who made mistakes, who feared. And they spoke, always with a certain tension in their voices, of the one who belonged nowhere and everywhere, who could be man or woman or beast or flame, whose very nature was transformation, disruption, the breaking of oaths and boundaries. They called him the Sly One, the Sky Traveler, the Slanderer of the gods. They called him Lopter and Hvrangra, and by many other names spoken with equal parts fascination and dread. They called him Loki, and they knew, with the certainty of people who lived on the edge of survival, on islands of volcanic rock in the freezing northern sea, that chaos cannot be locked away forever, that the earthquake is not random, that the serpent that circles the world will one day let go of its own tail, that the wolf in the darkness grows stronger with every passing winter, and that the trickster, bound beneath the earth with his own son's entrails, screaming as venom burns his face, will break free, that when he does, he will bring the end of everything, and he will smile as the world burns. The people who told these stories were not primitive. They were not naive. They were the Norse, the Scandinavian peoples of the Viking Age and the centuries before and after, speakers of Old Norse, a language that carved meaning with the precision of runes cut into stone. From roughly the 8th century through the 13th, these seafaring peoples ranged from the coasts of Greenland and Vinland to the rivers of what would become Russia, from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire. They were farmers and traders, warriors and poets, explorers who navigated by sun and stars, across waters that could swallow a ship without trace. They built kingdoms in Iceland and Norway, Sweden and Denmark. They established settlements, legal assemblies called things, complex social structures, and they carried with them a cosmology as intricate and unforgiving as the world they inhabited. The Norse universe was not heaven and earth, not a simple division between divine and mortal. It was Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash that held 9 worlds in its roots and branches. Asgard, realm of the Facer gods connected to Midgard, the middle world of humans, by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. Jotunheim, land of the Jotnar, the giants, ancient and enormous, beings of stone and ice and storm. Niflheim, the realm of primordial ice and mist. Muspelheim, the realm of fire. Mofheim of the light elves, Svartalfheim of the dwarves, and Helheim, the realm of the dead. The tree's roots drew from wells of wisdom and fate. Its branches sheltered an eagle and a dragon gnawing at the root, and a squirrel that ran between them carrying insults. Everything was connected, everything was alive, and nothing was permanent. The gods themselves knew this. The Facer, Odin the All-Father, one-eyed seeker of wisdom. Thor the Thunderer with his hammer Mjolnir. Frigg the Queen, Tyr the war god who sacrificed his hand. Heimdall the watchman with his horn, Baldr the beautiful and beloved. These were not immortal in the way later. religions would define immortality. They maintained their youth only by eating the golden apples of Idun. They could be wounded, they could be killed, and they knew they would be killed. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the twilight of the powers, was not a possibility. It was a certainty, spoken of in prophecy, seen in vision, inevitable as winter following autumn. The gods knew that the wolf would break his chains, that the serpent would rise from the sea, that the dead would sail in a ship made of fingernails, that fire would consume the world, that they would die fighting. And still they built their halls. Still they held their feasts. Still they defended the order they had created against the chaos that surrounded it on every side. This was the theological framework, not salvation but survival, not eternal bliss but a glorious death, and perhaps after everything burned, a new green earth rising from the waves. The Norse did not expect justice. They expected word, fate, the pattern woven by the Norns, the pattern that even Odin could see but not change. What mattered was how you met your fate, courage in the face of the inevitable, honor even when the cause was lost, the willingness to sacrifice your hand, your eye, your son, yourself, for wisdom, for victory, for one more day before the end. Into this worldview, into this landscape of volcanic stone and dark forests, into this cosmology of doomed gods and certain apocalypse, Loki arrived. Or perhaps he was always. The sources are unclear, which is fitting for a being whose very nature is ambiguity. He is called a god, and he lives among the Facer in Asgard, but he is not born of gods. His father is Farborti, a giant. His mother is Laufey, also known as Now. He is Jotun by birth, Facer by adoption or association. He is Odin's blood, brother, not brother by birth, but bound by an oath sworn in ancient days. Mixed blood making them kin in a way more sacred than mere family. This makes him uncle to Thor, not brother. The relationship popularized by modern Loki is not Thor's sibling. He is Thor's uncle through the deepest form of oath, bond known to the Norse, a bond Odin himself will not break, even as Loki brings murder and treachery into the heart of Asgard. The very name Loki is uncertain in origin. Some scholars connect it to a word meaning to close, to end, suggesting he is the one who closes the chapter, who brings things to their conclusion. Others link it to words for flame or lightning, the sudden flash, the destructive fire. Still others suggest knot or tangle, the snarl in the thread of fate. All of these fit. He is the end and the flame and the knot. He is the disruption in the pattern, and the sources that speak of him, primarily the poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems preserved in the 13th century Icelandic manuscript, known as the Codex Regius, and the prose Edda written by the Icelandic scholar and politician Snorri Sturluson around 1220, present him as something the gods need but cannot trust, use but cannot control, tolerate but cannot kill. The Norse had no single orthodoxy, no unified church, no standardized scripture. What we call Norse mythology is a reconstruction from fragments, skaldic poetry preserved by memory, and later written down, the two Eddas, archaeological evidence from runestones and carved images, references in sagas, the observations of Christian writers encountering the last practitioners of the old ways. Much was lost when Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland converted to Christianity between the 10th and 12th centuries. What survived did so because Christian Icelanders like Snorri Sturluson saw value in preserving the poetry and stories of their ancestors, even as they themselves prayed to Christ. This creates interpretive challenges. We cannot always know what details Snorri added or altered to make the stories comprehensible to his Christian contemporaries. We cannot fully hear the poems as a Viking, age worshipper would have heard them. But what comes through, again and again, is the figure of Loki as necessary catastrophe. The gods know what he is, they know what he will become, and they keep him close anyway, because sometimes you need a liar to retrieve what was stolen, a shapeshifter to infiltrate the enemy, a clever tongue to talk your way out of an impossible bargain, until the day his cleverness turns against them. until the day he stops being useful and becomes unforgivable. To understand what Loki is, you must first abandon the idea of stable categories. He is not a god of any one thing. He is not the god of fire, though fire is one of his aspects. He is not the god of lies, though he lies constantly. He has no domain, no portfolio, no consistent iconography. What he has is fluidity. The prose Edda describes him as pleasing and handsome in appearance, evil in character, very capricious in behavior. Snorri Sturluson writes that he is counted among the Fésir, though he is the origin of all deceit, and he has disgraced gods and men. But what Loki looks like depends on when you are looking and from what angle. In the Lokasenna, the flighting of Loki, one of the poems in the poetic Edda, he crashes a feast of the gods after murdering one of their servants, and he appears in his usual form, able to speak, to argue, to seduce and insult with equal facility. But this is one shape among countless others. Loki is a shapeshifter without parallel in Norse mythology. Other gods have their animal forms. Odin becomes an eagle, Freya a falcon. But these are temporary adoptions, magic cloaks that grant the animal's shape. Loki's transformations are total and biological. He does not merely look like a mare. He becomes a mare fertile and receptive, and bears a foal. He does not merely appear as a salmon. In the Farimskvir, the poem of Thrym, he transforms into a handmaid to accompany Thor, disguised as the goddess Freya to the realm of the giants. In the Regensum Fael and the subsequent sections of the Vifæ saga, he becomes a salmon to escape the wrath of a dwarf. In the Gylfaginning section of the prose Edda, Snorri recounts that he became a fly to sabotage the forging of Thor's hammer, became a seal to fight Heimdall for the Bjarfeysingamen necklace, became an old woman to prevent any creature from weeping for the dead god Baldr. Gender is no barrier. Loki is male in most stories, husband to the goddess Sigyn, father to several children. But he is also female, mother to an 8-legged horse. The Norse sources treat this without prurient detail or moral condemnation in the way a Christian text might. It simply is. Loki's transformations are not metaphorical. They are ontological. He rewrites his own substance. His children reveal his nature more than any single story. With his wife Sigyn, he has 2 sons, Nafi and Vali, mortal or nearly mortal, doomed to terrible fates. But his other children, the ones born in Jotunheim with the giantess Angrboda, are monsters that will end the world. First, Hel, whose name means hidden or concealed. She is half living, half corpse, her body divided down the middle, one side the flesh of a woman, the other the rotting blue-black of death. Odin takes her and casts her into Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist and the dead, and makes her ruler there. She governs those who die of sickness or old age, those who do not fall in battle, and therefore do not go to Valhalla or Folkvang. Her hall is called Eljudnir, misery. Her table is hunger. Her knife is famine. Her bed is sick. She is depicted in later medieval Icelandic texts as impassive, neither cruel nor kind, simply the administrator of the inevitable. She is death not as punishment, but as destination. Second, Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, the world serpent. Odin takes this child and hurls it into the ocean that encircles Midgard, the realm of humans. The serpent grows. It grows until it circles the entire world, its body wrapping around the earth beneath the waves, its tail in its mouth, the Ouroboros, the symbol of eternity and of the cycle that sustains the world. As long as the serpent holds its tail, the world is bounded. When it lets go, the ocean will rise. Thor and the serpent are destined enemies. They meet twice before the end. Once when Thor, fishing with the giant Hymir, hooks the serpent and nearly drags it from the depths before Hymir cuts the line in terror. And again at Ragnarok, when Thor will kill the serpent and then die from its venom 9 steps later. Jormungandr is poison and inevitability made flesh, or made scale and fang. It is the boundary and the breaking of the boundary. Third, Fenrir, the wolf. In the Gylfaginning, Snorri recounts the story. The gods see the wolf growing among them, growing faster and larger than any natural wolf. And they know the prophecy. They know this wolf will kill Odin. They decide to bind it. Twice they try with chains, and twice Fenrir breaks them as a game, proud of his strength. So the gods commission the dwarves to make a binding that cannot be broken. The dwarves forge Gleipnir from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Gleipnir is soft as silk and impossible to break. The gods bring it to Fenrir and propose another test of his strength. Fenrir is suspicious. He is a wolf, but he is intelligent, perhaps more intelligent than the gods give him credit for. He agrees to let them bind him only if one of the gods places a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, a promise that this is truly just a game, that they will release him if he cannot break free. Only Tyr, the god of war and oaths, is brave enough or honorable enough. He places his right hand between Fenrir's jaws. The gods bind the wolf. Fenrir struggles and cannot break free. The gods do not release him. They anchor the binding to a massive stone, drive the stone deep into the earth, and Fenrir bites down. Tyr loses his hand at the wrist. The wolf is left bound, jaws propped open by a sword, drool running from his mouth to form a river. He will remain there until Ragnarok, when the binding will break, and he will run free with jaws that stretch from earth to sky, and he will devour the All-Father. These are Loki's children with Angrboda, a goddess of death, a serpent that holds the world together until it destroys it, and a wolf that waits in the dark to kill the king of the gods. This is Loki's legacy in flesh and scale and fang. But there is a 4th child, and this one is different. In the Gylfaginning, Snorri tells how the gods once needed a wall built around Asgard to protect them from the giants. A builder arrived, claiming he could complete the wall in a single winter. But his price was the goddess Freya, the sun, and the moon. The gods, on Loki's advice, agreed, but only if the builder could finish in 1 winter with no help from any man. The builder asked only to use his horse, Svadilfari. The gods agreed, and the builder began to work. The horse was not a normal horse. It hauled stones the size of halls, worked day and night without tiring. As winter drew to a close, the wall was nearly complete. The gods realized they would have to pay the price. They turned on Loki in fury. This was his idea, and now Freya would be lost. The sun and moon taken, and the world plunged into darkness. Loki, faced with the rage of the gods, promised to fix it. That night, as the builder worked to set the final stones, a mare appeared from the forest. Svadilfari caught her scent and bolted, dragging the builder after him, abandoning the wall. The mare led the stallion into the forest and did not return. The wall was not completed by the deadline. The builder, revealed in his rage to be a giant in disguise, was killed by Thor with a blow from Mjolnir. And months later, Loki returned to Asgard. He was walking strangely. He was no longer pregnant, but he brought with him a foal, 8-legged, grey as storm clouds, faster than any horse in any of the 9 worlds. Loki gave the foal to Odin, who named it Sleipnir. It became the All-Father's steed, the horse that could ride through air and over the sea, into the land of the dead and back. The greatest of all horses, born because Loki became a mare and seduced a giant stallion to save the gods from their own bargain. This is what Loki is. Not a god of one thing, but a being of transformation, of boundaries crossed, of deals made and broken, of problems solved by creating worse problems, of gender and species and loyalty as fluid as water, as changing as flame. Depictions of Loki in the archaeological record are sparse and ambiguous. A carving on a stone from Snaptune, Denmark, dated to around 1000 CE, shows a face with lips sewn shut, believed by many scholars to represent Loki after the dwarves sewed his mouth. Closed in punishment for losing a wager, a story told in the SK Faldskapam Fael section of the Prose Edda. A stone from Kirkby Stephen, England, may show a bound figure, possibly Loki in his final punishment. But unlike Thor with his hammer, or Odin with his spear and ravens, Loki has no consistent visual iconography. He is in the margins, He is in the stories the skalds tell, but not in the carvings on the runestones. He is the one the warriors don't invoke before battle, the one farmers don't offer to for a good harvest, the one sailors don't pray to for safe passage. He is necessary to the stories, but not to the cult. He is in the mythology, but perhaps not in the religion, or only in whispers, in the acknowledgement that chaos exists, and sometimes wears a pleasing face. The myths of Loki are a progression in the early stories. He is an asset, a problem solver, annoying perhaps, immoral certainly, but useful. In the later stories, he is a curse, and there is one myth that marks the turning point. The moment Loki crosses from trickster to monster, from tolerable to unforgivable. But we must start earlier, with the tricks that merely humiliated, that cost the gods their pride but not their lives. In the SK Faldskapalm Fae, Snorri recounts the story of Sif's hair. Sif, the wife of Thor, had hair of pure gold, actual gold growing from her head, the most beautiful in all the realms. One night, Loki cut it all off. Why? Snorri offered, perhaps simply because he could. Thor discovered the act and seized Loki by the throat, would have broken every bone in his body. But Loki swore he would go to the dwarves, the master smiths, and have them forge new hair for Sif. Real gold that would grow like natural hair. Thor agreed, and Loki went into the earth. He came first to the sons of Ivaldi, dwarves of great skill, and commissioned the hair. And while they worked, he challenged them. Could they make other treasures as well? Gifts for the gods. The dwarves, proud of their craft, forged 3 masterworks. The golden hair for Sif Skidbladnir, a ship that could hold all the gods but fold up to fit in a pocket, and which would always have a favorable wind. And Gungnir, a spear that would never miss its target. Loki took these treasures, but his mind was already working. He went to 2 other dwarves, Broker and his brother Atri, and wagered his own head that they could not forge treasures greater than those made by the sons of Ivaldi. The dwarves accepted. Atri began to work the bellows and forge, instructing Broker to pump the bellows without ceasing, or the work would be ruined. Loki, in the form of a fly, bit Broker again and again, trying to make him stop. First, Atri pulled from the fire a golden boar, Gullinbursti, whose bristles glowed and who could run through air and water faster than any horse. Second, he pulled out Dropnir, a golden arm, ring that would drip 8 new rings of equal weight every 9th night. And third, he began to forge a hammer. But as the work reached its critical moment, Loki the fly bit Broker on the eyelid so viciously that blood ran into his eye. Broker's hand slipped from the bellows for just an instant. The hammer came out of the fire slightly malformed. Its handle was too short, but it was still Mjolnir, the weapon that could level mountains, that would always return to Thor's hand, that could be shrunk down and hidden in his shirt. The dwarves brought their treasures to Asgard, and the gods judged Mjolnir the greatest of all. Broker demanded Loki's head. Loki argued that he had wagered his head, yes, but not his neck. And Broker could not take the head without cutting the neck, which was not part of the bargain. The gods, amused, agreed. Broker, furious, settled for sewing Loki's lips shut with an awl and leather thong. Loki tore the stitches out, and the gods had their greatest treasures, all because Loki committed a petty cruelty and then talked his way through the consequences. This is Loki as useful, Loki as catalyst. The gods gain Odin's spear, Thor's hammer, Freya's boar, all because Loki is Loki. Another story, from the Hostel Fane, a skaldic poem by Faye J. Feilalfra of H. Veneer, and retold in the Prose Edda. The theft of Idun, Odin, Loki, and the god Hoenir were traveling through the mountains when they grew hungry. They killed an ox and tried to roast it, but the meat would not cook no matter how high they built the fire. A voice from above mocked them. An enormous eagle sat in a tree, and it told them the fire would not work until the eagle had its share. Desperate and hungry, the gods agreed. The eagle took the best parts of the ox. Loki, furious at being cheated, grabbed a long pole and struck the eagle. The pole stuck to the eagle, and his hand stuck to the pole, and the eagle took flight, dragging Loki through the air, smashing him against rocks and trees. Loki screamed for mercy. The eagle revealed itself as the giant Jazi in eagle form, and demanded a price for Loki's release. Loki must lure Idun, keeper of the golden apples of youth, out of Asgard without her apples. If the gods lost Idun, they would lose the apples, and without the apples, they would age and wither and die like mortals. Loki agreed. He returned to Asgard and told Idun he had found apples in the forest even more beautiful than hers, and she must bring her own apples to compare. Idun, trusting, left Asgard with her basket. Jazi, the eagle, seized her and carried her to his hall in Jotunheim. The gods began to age. Their hair turned grey, their skin wrinkled, their strength faded. They realized Idun was missing and interrogated Loki, who finally confessed. The gods gave him a choice: retrieve Idun or die. Loki borrowed Freya's falcon cloak, flew to Tarsi's hall, turned Idun into a nut, and carried her back to Asgard in his talons. Tarsi discovered the theft and pursued in eagle form. The gods saw them coming and lit a great fire on the walls of Asgard. Loki the falcon flew through. Tarsi the eagle, following too close, was caught in the flames. He fell and Thor killed him with Mjolnir. Once again, Loki creates the catastrophe and then solves it. Once again, he is forgiven because he is useful. Once again, the best of them, but he begins to have dreams of his own death. Frigg, desperate to protect him, travels through all the 9 worlds and extracts an oath from everything in existence. Every stone, every tree, every metal, every beast, every illness, that none will harm Baldr, and indeed nothing can. The gods make a game of it, throwing weapons at Baldr, watching them bounce off harmlessly, laughing at his invulnerability. All of this is recounted in the Gylfaginning and in the Vifi Luspe, the prophecy of the Ceres, the first and most important poem in the Poetic Edda. Loki, watching this, asks Frigg if truly everything has sworn the oath. She admits there was one thing she overlooked: mistletoe, a small plant that grows west of Valhalla, too young and harmless to bother with. Loki goes and retrieves a sprig of mistletoe. He returns to the gathering, where the gods are still hurling weapons at Baldr. He approaches Baldr's brother, Hodr, who is blind and standing apart, unable to join the game. Loki offers to help him honor Baldr like the others. He places the mistletoe in Hodr's hand and guides his aim. Hodr throws. The mistletoe pierces Baldr's heart. The god falls dead. The silence that follows is total. This is not a game gone wrong, this is murder. Frigg sends Odin's other son, Hermod, to Helheim to plead with Hel for Baldr's return. Hel agrees on one condition: if everything in the world weeps for Baldr, she will release him. If even one thing refuses to weep, he stays in the realm of the dead. The gods send messengers to all corners of existence, and everything weeps. Stones weep, metals weep, trees weep. Every living thing sheds tears for Baldr, except one. In a cave, the messengers find a giantess named Thok. She refuses to weep. "Let Hel hold what she has," Thok says. And it is widely believed, though not stated explicitly in the surviving texts, that Thok was Loki in disguise. Baldr remains dead. The light of the gods is extinguished, and Loki has crossed the final line. What follows is recounted in the Lokasenna and the Gylfaginning. Loki flees, but he knows he will be hunted. He builds a house on a mountain with doors facing all directions so he can see anyone approaching. During the day, he turns himself into a salmon and hides in a waterfall. He invents the fishing net while considering how the gods might catch him, and in inventing it, gives them the tool they need. Odin, from his high seat, sees everything. The gods come. Loki leaps into the river as a salmon. The gods drag the net through the water. Loki leaps over it. They weight the net with stones. Loki hides between 2 rocks. Thor wades into the center and grabs the salmon with his bare hands. Loki writhes and slips through, but Thor squeezes, and the salmon's body narrows at the tail, which is why, the story says, salmon are shaped that way. Thor lifts Loki from the water, and the shapeshifter is forced back into his true form, exhausted, caught. They take him to a cave. They take his son Nafi and transform Loki's other son, Vali, into a wolf. The wolf, maddened, tears out Nafi's entrails. The gods use the entrails as rope, binding Loki to 3 great stones. One under his shoulders, one under his loins, one under his knees. Then the giantess Skadi, Tarsi's daughter, brings a venomous serpent and fixes it above Loki's face so that its venom drips onto him. The bindings turn to iron, and there Loki lies, in the dark, in agony, but Sigyn, his wife, remains. She sits beside him with a bowl, catching the venom before it falls on his face. She stays, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. When the bowl fills, she must turn away to empty it, and in those moments, the venom drips onto Loki's face. He writhes in agony. The earth shakes. You feel it as an earthquake, the tremors of his torment. Sigyn returns and catches the venom again, and the earth is still. This is how it will remain until Ragnarok. The trickster, bound, the faithful wife, steadfast, and the earth shaking with his screams. The Norse did not have temples in the way Mediterranean or Near Eastern religions did. There was no priestly caste in the early Viking Age, no centralized religious authority. Worship was localized, personal, often conducted by chieftains or heads of households. Sacred spaces were often natural, groves, springs, particular stones, or else simple wooden structures that have not survived. The great temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described by the 11th century writer Adam of Bremen in his Gesta Hammerbergensis, Ecclesiae Pontificum, is one of the few structures we have detailed accounts of, and even that description comes from a Christian outsider and must be read with caution. Adam describes a golden temple with idols of Thor, Odin, and Freya, and a sacred grove where sacrifices were hung, animals, and, he claims, humans every 9 years, a great festival. Whether Adam's account is fully accurate or contains exaggerations for Christian shock value is debated, but it points to the reality that Norse religion involved blood sacrifice. Animals, horses, cattle, boars, were killed and their meat shared in communal feasts called BL feasts. The blood was sprinkled on altars and on the participants as a blessing. These were not somber, mournful rites, but social and sacred events that bound the community together and honored the gods and spirits. The Ynglinga saga, part of Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, describes seasonal BL fates. At the beginning of winter for a good year, at midwinter for good crops, and in summer for victory. The chieftain presided, speaking the words, making the offerings, ensuring the gods' favor. But there is no evidence of a cult of Loki, no temples dedicated to him, no altars with his name, no prayers preserved in his honor. Unlike Thor, who was invoked for protection and strength, or Freya for love and fertility, or Odin for wisdom and victory in battle, Loki seems to have existed in the mythology, but not in the devotional practice. He appears in the stories the Skalds told in the kennings, poetic circumlocutions they used: father of the serpent, theft, phase, slanderer of the gods. But he was not someone you prayed to. He was not someone you wanted the favor of. There is one interesting exception, though its interpretation is contested. Some scholars have noted that fire was sacred in Norse households, and the hearth fire was never to go out. There are folk traditions, recorded much later, that associate Loki with fire, with the sudden flare, up the wildfire, the dangerous flame. The Old Norse word logi means flame. And in one poem, Loki is paired with Logi in a contest, though they are clearly separate figures. Whether Loki was originally a fire spirit, later anthropomorphized into a trickster god, is a matter of scholarly debate with no definitive answer. What is clear is that by the time the Eddas were written, Loki was not primarily a fire deity, but something more complex and dangerous. The god who should not be a god, the giant among the Faesir, the Oathbreaker, the shapeshifter, the one whose children will end the world. The ritual year for the Norse was tied to the agricultural cycle and the turning of the seasons. Midsummer and midwinter were particularly sacred times. The winter solstice, Yule, involved feasting and sacrifice to ensure the return of the sun. Communities gathered in great halls, drank mead and ale, told stories, recited poetry. The Skalds held a place of honor, for they were the keepers of memory, the ones who preserved the deeds of heroes and the wisdom of the gods in verse complex, enough that it could not be easily forgotten or altered. The kennings they used were layered and elusive. Odin might be called Raven, God or God of the Hanged, or Lord of Valhalla. Loki might be called Thief of the Necklaces, or foe of Heimdall, a reference to a fight over the Br for Sigyn that is mentioned, but never fully detailed in surviving texts. These were not simple epithets but puzzles, poetry that required knowledge of the myths to decode. At these gatherings, the stories of Loki would have been told, perhaps with laughter at his cleverness, his obscene insults, his ability to escape any binding until he couldn't. Perhaps with unease, knowing how the story ended, perhaps with the recognition that chaos is always present, always close, always waiting for the moment when the bonds break. The gods themselves, in the myths, seem to treat Loki with a combination of tolerance and dread. They invite him to their feasts, include him in their councils, send him on quests, and yet they never fully trust him. In the Lokasenna, the poem where Loki crashes the feast and insults every god present, accusing Odin of cowardice, Frigg of adultery, Freya of sleeping with every god and elf, Thor of losing his hand, each accusation more vicious than the last. The gods do not kill him immediately. They argue with him. They trade insults. It is only when he boasts of killing Baldr that Thor arrives and threatens him with Mjolnir, and even then, Loki leaves of his own accord, promising that this is the last feast they will hold. He is right. Some scholars have interpreted Loki as a figure of liminality, existing on the threshold between order and chaos, insider and outsider, male and female, god and giant, helpful and harmful. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. Others see him as a representation of the principle of entropy, the inevitable breakdown of order, the second law of thermodynamics made into a character. The gods build walls, Loki breaks them. The gods make oaths, Loki breaks them. The gods try to bind fate. Loki is the proof that fate cannot be bound. And yet, for all his betrayals, the gods do not kill him until after Baldr's death. They punish him in ways that are cruel but not final, sewing his lips, binding him in a cave. Why? Perhaps because they need him. Perhaps because Odin, his blood brother, the wolf, will still break free. The serpent will still rise. The ship of the dead will still sail. Loki is not the cause of Ragnarok. He is its herald, its embodiment, its inevitability given a grinning face. When Christianity came to Scandinavia, it came not with a single invasion, but over centuries, through trade routes, political marriages, missionary efforts, and eventually royal decree. Norway's King Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled from 995 to 1000 CE, and his successor Olaf II Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, actively worked to convert their subjects, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through force. Iceland converted in the year 1000 CE, though the decision was pragmatic as much as spiritual. The Althing, the National Assembly, voted to adopt Christianity officially to avoid civil war, while allowing private practice of the old ways. Sweden converted more gradually, with the temple at Uppsala reportedly still functioning into the late 11th century. Denmark converted earlier, with King Harald Bluetooth's conversion around 960 CE marking the official shift. Though folk practices persisted, Christian missionaries and chroniclers saw the Norse gods through a specific lens, as demons or at best, as misremembered patriarchs, ancient kings later deified by ignorant pagans. This interpretive framework, known as euhemerism, after the Greek writer Euhemerus, was common in medieval Christian thought. Snorri Sturluson himself, writing in Christian Iceland in the 13th century, begins his prose Edda with a Eucharistic preface, suggesting that the Facer were originally Trojan refugees, led by a king named Odin, who traveled north and was later worshipped as a god. Most modern scholars regard this as Snorri's attempt to make the material acceptable to his Christian audience and patrons, not as genuine belief. The figure of Loki presented a particular problem for Christian interpreters. He was too obviously dangerous, too clearly adversarial, to be simply a misremembered hero. Some saw him as a Norse version of the devil, the liar, the accuser, the one who brings death and will lead the forces of destruction at the end of the world. The parallel to Satan is not exact, but it is strong enough that medieval and early modern commentators drew the connection. Loki, like Satan, is beautiful and persuasive. Like Satan, he is a shapeshifter and a liar. Like Satan, he is bound in torment until the final days, when he will break free and make war on the divine order. He is Odin's brother. His children are part of the cosmic structure. Hel rules the dead. Jormungandr holds the world together. Fenrir represents the ultimate threat that gives the gods purpose. Without Loki's tricks, the gods would not have their greatest treasures. Without Loki's crimes, the gods would have no reason to bind him. Without Loki, there is no Ragnarok. And without Ragnarok, the Norse cosmos has no eschatological meaning, no final confrontation, no glorious end. The Icelandic scholar and Bishop Guðfi Brandr Feykor Feiksson, who produced a map of the North Atlantic in 1590, included illustrations from Norse mythology, showing a continued cultural interest in the old stories, even centuries after conversion. But by then, Loki and the other gods were no longer objects of worship. They were literary heritage, cultural memory, stories that belonged to the past. The Prose Edda was copied and studied not as scripture, but as a handbook for understanding the complex poetic tradition of the Skalds, whose work was admired for its artistry, even by Christians who rejected its content as spiritually false. Elsewhere in Europe, the Norse gods were less well known. Classical and medieval writers from the Mediterranean world had limited contact with Scandinavia and often confused or conflated Norse and Germanic traditions. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century CE in his Germania, describes the religious practices of the Germanic tribes, but does not name the gods in their own terms, instead using Roman equivalents: Mercury for Odin, Hercules for Thor. Later writers continued this pattern, and it was not until the rediscovery and translation of the Eddas in the 17th and 18th centuries that the Norse pantheon became known in detail outside of Scandinavia. The Enlightenment brought a new interpretive framework. Scholars influenced by rationalism saw all mythology as primitive science, early human attempts to explain natural phenomena. In this view, Thor was thunder personified, Freya was fertility, Loki was wildfire, or perhaps the unpredictability of nature. This reductionist approach stripped the myths of their theological depth, but did popularize them among educated Europeans. The Romantic movement of the 19th century swung in the opposite direction, seeing in Norse mythology a kind of noble savagery, a heroic worldview uncorrupted by Christian meekness. Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, a cycle of 4 operas based loosely on Norse and Germanic sources, premiered between 1869 and 1876, presenting a vision of the gods as flawed and doomed, struggling against fate. Loki does not appear directly in Wagner's Ring, but the figure of Logefire is clearly derived from him, a clever, ambiguous character who helps and hinders the gods in equal measure. The scholar Jacob Grimm, better known for fairy tales, published Deutsche Mythology in 1835, an exhaustive study of Germanic and Norse mythology that attempted to reconstruct the original beliefs from fragmented sources. Grimm noted the similarities between Loki and other trickster figures in world mythology: Prometheus, Coyote, Anansi, beings who transgress boundaries, steal from the gods or for the gods, and occupy an ambiguous moral space. But Grimm also noted what makes Loki unique: his trajectory from helper to destroyer, from insider to ultimate outsider, from the one who solves problems to the one who becomes the problem. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars were applying comparative mythology and early anthropological methods to Norse religion. Sir James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, published in multiple editions between 1890 and 1915, included Baldra's death in its analysis of dying and rising gods, comparing him to Adonis, Osiris, and Christ. Loki, in this framework, became the agent of necessary death, the winter that must come before spring. Later, the psychologist Carl Jung would interpret mythological figures as archetypes of the collective unconscious, and Loki would be understood as the shadow, the dark double, the repressed chaos that the ego, the Asya, tries to bind but cannot ultimately control. These interpretations, however insightful, are also distortions. They impose external frameworks: Christian theology, Enlightenment rationalism, Romantic nationalism, Jungian psychology, on a religious tradition that had its own internal logic, its own concerns, its own vision of the cosmos. The Norse who told these stories were not thinking about archetypes or allegories. They were thinking about the real presence of the gods, the real threat of the giants, the real certainty that the world would end in fire and ice and the jaws of monsters. And Loki, for them, was not a symbol. He was a name spoken with caution, a presence in the stories, a warning. The 20th century saw the first serious attempts at reconstructing Norse paganism as a living religious practice. In Iceland, the Feysatrafeyarf, Feylagi Fey. The Feysatrafey Association was officially recognized by the government in 1973, the first new pagan organization to gain legal status in a Western nation. Feysatrafey, meaning faith in the Feysa, draws on the Eddas and sagas to recreate rituals, holidays, and ethical frameworks. Practitioners hold BL fates, honor the gods at seasonal festivals, and often identify with particular deities as patrons. Loki's place in modern Feytarfey is contested. Some groups and individuals honor him as a complex, necessary figure, a god of change and transformation, the one who forces growth through discomfort. Others exclude him entirely, viewing him as the betrayer, the one responsible for Baldr's death and the doom of the gods, someone to be acknowledged but not honored. This division reflects a broader tension in Reconstructionist paganism, how to honor a tradition that includes morally ambiguous or outright malevolent figures. Do you worship the whole pantheon, or only the gods you find personally appealing or morally acceptable? Those who do honor Loki often identify him with marginalized identities and experiences. As a shapeshifter who transcends gender, who becomes female and bears children, Loki has become a figure of queer and trans spirituality. As the outsider, the blood, brother rather than the biological kin, the one who is tolerated but never fully accepted, he resonates with people who feel themselves on the margins of their communities. As the trickster, he appeals to those who question authority, who see the rigidity of social structures as something to be disrupted and reimagined. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th and 21st centuries have continued to shed light on the Viking Age. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway, excavated in 1904, revealed a 9th century ship containing 2 women, one young and one old, along with richly decorated artifacts, tapestries that may depict mythological scenes, and evidence of the complexity of Norse society and belief. The Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880, provided a nearly intact Viking longship. Runestones across Scandinavia, many raised in the 10th and 11th centuries during the transition to Christianity, provide inscriptions that sometimes reference the gods, though often in cryptic or poetic language. One of the most significant finds was the discovery of a 10th century silver amulet at Legra in Denmark in 1987, depicting what appears to be a figure with exaggerated lips. If the interpretation is correct, it would be one of the few clear physical representations of Loki from the Viking Age itself. But the interpretation is not certain. The figure could be another deity, another mythological character, or a purely decorative motif. This is the challenge with much of Norse archaeology. The written sources came late, recorded by Christians, and the physical evidence is fragmentary. We are assembling a puzzle with many pieces missing. The digital age has created new communities of Norse paganism, new scholarship, and new arguments. Online forums, social media groups, and YouTube channels devoted to Feysatra, Fey heathenry, and Norse mythology have exploded in number. Some are scholarly and careful, drawing on peer-reviewed research and primary sources. Others are fanciful, blending New Age ideas, pop culture, and fantasy into a syncretic stew. And some have been co-opted by white nationalist and neo-Nazi groups who distort Norse symbolism, runes, hammers, wolves, into emblems of racial purity and violent supremacy. Mainstream Feysatrafey organizations have forcefully rejected these appropriations. The Troth, an international heathen organization, has a clear anti-racist statement. The Feysatrafeylar Fey in Iceland has condemned the use of Norse symbols by hate groups. Scholars like Kevin Hudson and Joshua Rood have documented the historical dishonesty of these groups, noting that the Vikings were traders and explorers who interacted with and often intermarried with people from across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and even potentially North America. The idea of racial purity is a modern invention, a projection of 19th and 20th century pseudoscience onto a past that was far more diverse and interconnected than white supremacists want to acknowledge. Loki, in this contemporary landscape, has become a flashpoint. For some far-right groups, he is the traitor, the outsider, the one who pollutes the divine order, a coded way of expressing xenophobia and hatred of anyone who does not fit their narrow definition of belonging. For others, he is precisely the opposite, the one who exposes the hypocrisy of the facer, who refuses to bow to authority, who survives by wit rather than strength, who transforms himself rather than conforming. Both readings are projections, shaped more by contemporary politics than by the medieval sources. But then, interpretation is always shaped by the interpreter's context. Snorri wrote as a Christian Icelander, trying to preserve and explain his ancestors' beliefs. We read as 21st century people navigating questions of identity, authority, belonging, and change. The myths remain, but their meanings shift. Loki's entry into popular culture began in earnest with the 19th century interest in Norse mythology. But it was the 20th century that made him a household name, for better or worse. In literature, Loki appears in various forms throughout the 1800s. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, in his work The Concept of Irony with continual reference to Socrates 1841, did not address Loki directly, but his analysis of irony and the destabilizing power of the questioning, ambiguous figure resonates with Loki's role in the myths. The Swedish author August Strindberg referenced Norse mythology throughout his work, and by the early 20th century, children's books were presenting sanitized, simplified versions of the Norse myths, often downplaying Loki's cruelty or presenting him as a misunderstood prankster. But it was in the late 20th century that Loki began to appear as a major character in Anglophone fiction. Roger Zelazny's 1980 science fantasy novel, The Mask of Loki, presented him as an immortal trickster manipulating events across time. Douglas Adams's novel The Long Dark Time of the Soul 1988 features Loki as a bored, scheming god in modern London, longing for the chaos of the old days. These were not reverent treatments, but they introduced the character to readers who might never have encountered the Eddas. Neil Gaiman's American Gods, published in 2001, includes a version of Loki called Low-Key Liesmith, as a con artist working with Odin, called Mr. Wednesday, in a modern America where the old gods have been forgotten and struggle to survive. Gaiman returned to Norse mythology in Norse Mythology 2017, a retelling of the classic stories that stays relatively faithful to the sources, while making them accessible to contemporary readers. Gaiman's Loki is clever, dangerous, and ultimately untrustworthy, killing Baldr and bringing the doom of the gods, but also strangely sympathetic in his intelligence and isolation. Joanne Harris's Rune Marks 2007 and its sequels present Loki as a major character in a post-Ragnarok world, exploring themes of identity and transformation. Rick Riordan's Magnus Chase series, 2015, Fed 2017, brings Loki into young adult fiction, portraying him as a villain, but one with complex motives. These literary treatments vary widely in tone and accuracy, but they share a fascination with Loki as a character who resists simple categorization, who is neither hero nor villain in any straightforward sense. In visual media, in the Marvel Universe, created by writer Stan Lee and artist Jack Kirby, Loki is reimagined as Thor's adopted brother, a sorcerer and schemer, whose primary motivation is jealousy and a desire for power. This is a profound departure from the sources. The mythological Loki is not Thor's brother, not adopted into Odin's family as a child, not motivated primarily by sibling rivalry. The Marvel version simplifies and sentimentalizes, creating a more accessible narrative for superhero comics, but losing the theological complexity and the existential dread. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, beginning with Thor 2011, cemented this interpretation in global popular culture. Actor Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of Loki as a charismatic, witty, tragic anti-hero made the character one of the franchise's most popular. Across multiple films, Thor 2011, The Avengers 2012, Thor: The Dark World 2013, Thor: Ragnarok 2017, Avengers: Infinity War 2018, and the Disney Faye series Loki 2021, Faye 2023. The MCU Loki undergoes a redemption arc, shifting from villain to reluctant hero, sacrificing himself, being resurrected, and ultimately becoming a guardian of the multiverse. This is about as far from the Norse Loki as it is possible to get. The MCU Loki does not bear monstrous children, does not kill the most beloved god out of spite, does not sail a ship of dead men's fingernails to burn the world. He does not scream beneath the serpent's venom. He becomes, by the end, heroic. This transformation reflects the demands of commercial storytelling. Audiences want characters they can root for, redemption arcs, emotional closure. A Loki who remains purely destructive, purely chaotic, purely monstrous does not fit the franchise formula. So Marvel filed down the sharp edges, added a tragic backstory, and made him a fan favorite. The success has been enormous. Loki is now one of the most recognizable figures from Norse mythology worldwide. But the Loki most people recognize is a corporate fiction, a superhero in horns and a cape, not the shapeshifter who became a mare or the father of the wolf that will devour the All-Father. Other media have used Loki in various ways. The video game series God of War beginning in 2018, reoriented from Greek to Norse mythology. And while the earlier games focused on other gods, 2022's God of War Ragnarök revealed a major character to be Loki under another name, exploring his identity and his role in the prophesied end of the world. The game treats the source material with more respect than Marvel, incorporating actual mythological elements and the moral complexity of the gods, though it still makes changes for gameplay and narrative reasons. The television series Vikings 2013 Fae 2020 did not feature Loki directly, as it focused on the human characters and their historical, if dramatized, exploits. But the mythology was referenced, and the show contributed to a broader popular interest in Norse culture. The fantasy genre more broadly, in books, games, films, and television, has been saturated with Norse-inspired elements, runes, hammers, berserkers, valkyries, and yes, trickster figures who owe a debt to Loki, even when they are not named as such. What has been lost in this popularization is the terror. The Loki of the sources is not a lovable scamp. He is the one who cuts a goddess's hair for no reason, other than cruelty. He is the one who causes the death of the best of the gods and then mocks the grieving mother. He is the father of monsters. He is bound with his own son's guts. He will break free and lead armies against the gods he once called brothers. And he will do it with a smile because chaos is his nature, destruction is his purpose, and the end is his vindication. This Loki is too dark, too strange, too genuinely frightening for mass market entertainment, and so he is softened, explained, made relatable. The cost is that the myth loses its power. Some modern heathens and Fae Satrafae practitioners have expressed frustration with the Marvel version, noting that it has become nearly impossible to talk about Loki in a spiritual or scholarly context without people bringing up Tom Hiddleston. Others have embraced it, seeing the popularization as a way to introduce people to the mythology, even in a distorted form, and hoping that some percentage will seek out the original sources. Both perspectives are valid. Pop culture is how most people encounter mythology today. The question is whether it serves as a bridge to deeper understanding or a substitute for it. So what does Loki mean for us, now in a world that bears little resemblance to the one that first told his stories? We live in an age of disruption. Climate systems are destabilizing. Political orders that seemed permanent are fracturing. Technologies we do not fully understand are reshaping society faster than we can adapt. The boundaries we thought were fixed, between nations, between genders, between human and machine, between truth and convincing lie, are revealed to be permeable, negotiable, constructed. We are, in a real sense, living through a transformation as profound as any in the myths. And we do not know if what comes after will be better or worse. We only know that the old order is ending. Loki, in this context, is not a metaphor for any one thing. He is the principle of change itself, not change that serves progress, not change that can be managed or directed toward a positive outcome, but change as an ontological reality, change that cannot be stopped or controlled, only endured or embraced. He is the reminder that the walls you build will be breached, the oaths you swear will be broken, the structures you depend on, political, economic, environmental, social, are only as stable as the forces that have not yet chosen to destroy them. And those forces are not external. They are woven into the structure itself. Loki is not an invader. He is Odin's blood brother. Chaos is not outside the system. It is part of the system. It always has been. This is a terrifying insight, and it is one the Norse understood. They did not believe in progress. In the arc of history bending toward justice, they believed in word, the pattern, the inevitable unfolding of consequences from actions, the web that the Norns weave and that no one, not even the gods, can alter. They knew that every structure contains the seeds of its own destruction. They knew that the wolf grows larger in the darkness. They knew that the serpent lets go of its tail. And they knew that when the trickster breaks free, there is no negotiating with him, no reasoning, no redemption. There is only the reckoning. But here is the other truth. After Ragnarok, the earth rises again. After the fire and the flood, after the gods fall and the monsters are slain, after everything is destroyed, the Vefeluspe tells us that the world comes back. Green and fertile. A new generation of gods survives. Baldr returns from Helheim. Odin's sons and Thor's sons inherit what remains. Two humans, Lelfaith and Elfaith survive by hiding in the wood Hodr famous Holt, and from them the world is repopulated. The cycle begins again, not because justice is served, not because the good are rewarded, but because that is the nature of existence. Destruction and creation, death and rebirth. Without his interference, the gods would stagnate. Without his challenges, they would grow complacent. Without his betrayal, there would be no Ragnarok. And without Ragnarok, there would be no renewal. He is the fire that clears the forest, so new growth can emerge. He is the earthquake that reminds us the ground is not as solid as we pretend. He is the lie that exposes the deeper truth. He is dangerous and necessary in equal measure, which is why the gods could not kill him, why they bound him instead. Knowing the binding would not hold forever, knowing it was never meant to. The question for us is not whether we want disruption. We do not get to choose. The question is what we do. We flee? Do we fight? Do we freeze in terror? Or do we recognize that the end of one world is the beginning of another? That transformation is the only constant, and that the trickster, for all his cruelty, for all his lies, for all the suffering he causes, is also the one who forces us to evolve or die. The myths do not offer comfort. They offer clarity. They tell us that the walls of Asgard will fall, that the gods themselves are mortal, that nothing, no matter how beautiful, how powerful, how beloved, lasts forever. And they tell us that the one who reminds us of this, the one who embodies it, is not a devil to be exorcised, but a truth to be faced. Loki is not the enemy of the gods. He is their shadow, their reflection, their inevitable consequence, and he is ours. So when the earth shakes, remember, it is not random. It is the trickster, bound beneath the stone, screaming as the venom burns. And one day, the binding will break, the serpent will rise, the wolf will run free, the ship of the dead will sail, and Loki will stand at the prow, laughing because he has been telling you all along. This is how it ends. This is how it always ends. Not with a whimper, but with fire and flood, and the jaws of monsters. And after the fire, after the flood, after everything you thought was permanent is ash and memory, the earth will rise again, green and terrible and new. And the cycle will begin once more. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.